Welcome back to the southwest of England and a series that hopes to showcase some of the best adventures that can be had in the counties of Devon and Cornwall. If you're joining me for the first time, my name's Caroline and so far I've explored some of the area's heritage and history, visiting Levant's Beam Engine, Castle Drogo and Finch Foundry. I've shared the gorgeous shepherd's hut we stayed in for a few nights and adventured through both beautiful inland cliffs at Devon's Lydford Gorge, as well as sea cliffs, swimming through, walking through and throwing myself off them as part of a coast-steering tour here in Cornwall. In today's episode, I'm hiking a stretch of the southwest coast path at the Lizard Peninsula. If during the video you find yourself enjoying it, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel so that you can join me in my Devon and Cornwall adventures. Welcome to the most southerly point in Great Britain, the Lizard Peninsula. We've come along here this morning to hike along a short stretch of the southwest coastal path from the Lizard Peninsula up to Kynance Cove. I'm not too sure how you pronounce it. Watching the weather forecast on the news this morning, it does look like we're going to have some real gusty gales of wind blowing in, quite an epic rainstorm this afternoon. So we're hoping to hop skip to it and be able to do this before the torrential rains arrive. A lot of the signage along this stretch of the southwest coastal path is telling us to look out for plenty of wildlife. In the sea specifically, we've been told to keep an eye out for dolphins, porpoises and seals. And certainly when it comes to the seals, we've seen so many, and this bay behind me has got loads in there, but there were also some back at the old life-saving station too. This area is also home to some of the really rare Cornish choughs, which I believe have become almost extinct at one point, but now they come here to nest, so I'm also going to be keeping a close eye out for those. I believe they look not too dissimilar to a crow, but they've got bright yellow beaks and also feet as well, so that's going to be the main giveaway for those guys. This stretch of the coastline is obviously very exposed, as you can see, and it lies on schist and serpentine rock. And when you combine that geology with the climate or the weather, it makes for a perfect location for a lot of rare wild flowers to grow. Some of the more vigorous flowers have to be managed so that some of the smaller ones that aren't quite as strong at growing do actually have an opportunity to be able to survive here. So at some points during the year, the conservation work consists of bringing cattle and ponies to eat some of these wild flowers, and apparently from spring until midsummer, and I would class it as being midsummer as to where we are at the moment, is the prime time to be able to come and appreciate all of these flowers. This section of the coastal path is definitely a lot busier than the section that we were at yesterday when we went to the tin mining area of it. But I can understand why it's so popular. The scenery just keeps on changing. It's very undulating, so it's not quite as easy and as flat as what we experienced yesterday. So you've got to go down to where you've got these trickling streams to be able to cross over them, and then the coastal path takes you back up onto the sea cliffs. Each time you sort of go through those, it just opens out to something that looks just a little bit different to what you've come from. So it's very, very varied, and I think for that reason it's probably why it is as popular as what it is. We've got to a section now along the southwest coastal path where there's loads of signs up saying warning and hazards, and that the cliff is quite likely to give way, and through to the point where here you can actually see that they've erected up a fence to make sure that we keep well away from the cliff edges. And we have just passed a lookout point looking down to what is quite a spectacular, raw and rugged beach, but the steps that once upon a time went down there, you can see that parts of those steps have now been washed away just by the sea, by Mother Nature. So yeah, definitely this section I'm keeping well clear of the cliff edges. We've made it to Kynance Cove. I'm probably still butchering the pronunciation of it, and true to the weather forecast's predictions, the winds have really started to pick up now. It's very busy. A lot of people over on the sort of dipping down to, I guess, where there's like a valley for the river, and then going back up the coastal path on the other side. There's a lot of people there, so I'm thinking that that might be quite a nice place to look down. Unfortunately, we have arrived at high tide, so you can't see the pretty white sands, but we'll certainly have a wander around and just check out what's here and what else there is to see from different angles. After getting down to the cove, we stopped off at the cafe for a little bit of lunch. I ended up going with the vegetarian Cornish pasty, although I'm not too sure if you can actually call it a Cornish pasty if it doesn't have the meat in it, but because I don't eat beef, it meant that I went with the one. I think it describes itself as being a cheese pasty, but the reality was there's a little bit of cheese in it, but there's a lot of potato and swede. I think that had it all been filled with cheese, it would have just been far too over the top. Even though it's really busy, it is absolutely stunning here, and I can understand why it attracts as many people as what it does. And despite the weather forecast this morning having said that it's going to get really cloudy, really windy, and then potentially some torrential rains this afternoon, the sun is desperately trying to peek through. So as you can probably see, I'm applying the sunscreen to avoid myself from getting sunburnt, because even though it is only the British sun, which isn't overly strong, I've definitely not built up much of a base tan given how terrible late spring and early summer has been. We've come up onto the other side now, so we've kept on walking along the coastal path, and we've got to a point where the path is full of bees, like hundreds and hundreds of them. And what's quite cool is there's these tiny holes in the soil, and the bees are just going in and out of them. And in the time that we've taken to have our lunch at the cafe, the tide started to go out, so the little bit of land in between the island and the mainland that we're currently on has now turned to quite a nice looking beach. I think still at the moment you can only get around to it by wading through the water, but I think that once it gets to the lowest of tides, it is then possible to just wander around without actually having to wade through the sea. So we'll see if we're still around at the time that we can go out there, because as you can probably see or have seen, I'm wearing hiking shoes and don't have any flip-flops or anything like that with me to go wading through the water. And just as we've got up to the top, back up to the viewing point, the rains have started. Now we are right next to the car park, but unfortunately it's not this car park that we parked at. We are several miles back along the coastal path. Given that it's raining, we are thinking we'll actually turn this into a circular. So we're here at the beach's car park. So we're going to go up to join and go diagonally along here, a little bit on the road, across the road, and then keep on going diagonally towards the village, and then it should be quite quick from that village back to where we originally parked the car. The inland footpath is so incredibly different to the southwest coastal path. Even though we're just a matter of a few hundred metres from the coast, it feels like we've come up onto this almost barren heathland, but obviously it's not barren because you've got these really hardy grasses and beautiful heather, just the swathes of purple running throughout. It's lovely, but it's definitely a lot more muddy up here. We've even passed a herd of cows, but we're definitely not in farmers' fields. I think they're just free roaming out here, but I do wonder which farm they belong to. I would say that if you are doing this in the summer months when it's been relatively dry, it's probably fine just to come in like a regular pair of trainers, but I imagine that in spring, autumn, winter, it's probably very, very muddy and boggy up here, so you definitely want something like a pair of hiking shoes that you don't mind getting quite muddy. And the next part of the inland footpath seems to be going literally through some cows. They have straddled the path, but we've watched quite a few parties go through already, one of which had a tiny little dog that actually barked in amongst the cows, so I think that they're quite placid. I think we're going to be okay. I'm just never great with animals. They're always so unpredictable. Hopefully I'm not about to get beaten up by one. Oh, that's great.
Zoom in on that.
Nature at its finest. As we've exited the field with all of the cows in it, there's this sign here that says keep your distance, and it's got a picture of a cow, a horse and a sheep on it, but it's very difficult to keep your distance when they are literally straddling the hiking path. After having walked back to the car, we have decided to come back down to the life-saving station, in part because the geology has really changed, because as the sea level has dropped, it means that there's lots of rocks that are now exposed, but we've realised that we can also walk along the beach. And as we were walking down the ramp, this kid came up to us and was like, oh, if you keep on walking along the beach, there's a cave. And it's actually really quite impressive. I kudos to this child for letting me know about it, because it just keeps on going back and it's full of so much sand as well. And then you just come out along the beach. So if you turn around, you can see you've got like the sea, and then you've got like the life-saving station and the ramp behind. And that life-saving station is also quite interesting because a lot of ships go past this part of the British Isles, and it's been very prone to shipwrecks, obviously with all of the rocks that are around here, and it's also why there's the lighthouse up at the very top. Towards the end of our time down on the beach watching the fisherman bring back in his boat and his catch, the heavens did start to open, so we cowered for a little bit watching him underneath a cliff overhang, but we have now braved it back up to the car, which is probably why you can see that my hair's a bit wet. I've probably still got a little bit of rainwater on my face, and just now cowering a little bit from the rain in the car, but today has been absolutely spectacular. The southwest coastal path this morning was wonderful. We didn't get to see any of the rare Cornish choughs, but I suppose there's a reason why they're called rare, but we did get to see loads of seals, so I think that's almost guaranteed. We weren't able to see any dolphins or porpoises, particularly the latter. We know how zippy they are in the water, so I wasn't expecting to. The actual cove of Kynance Cove was wonderful, even though it was very busy. It was very pretty, and obviously the cafe was a lovely stop off for lunch. The shortcut of the pathway back across land definitely was shorter than the zigzagging and hugging the coastline going out there, but obviously we did have to walk in amongst livestock, and there was one point where the path really narrowed, so if you are trying to socially distance still, that could be a little bit unnerving for anyone wanting to do that. That pathway eventually led us into the actual village of Lizard, and this morning when we drove in I just assumed that it was a village green in the middle, but as we walked back through it, it was heaving with cars, and it turns out that it's a car park that, if you are not a National Trust member, works out cheaper than paying for parking at the National Trust's car park, either here where we are currently at the Lizard Point or at Kynance Cove. They just ask for a donation and recommend about £3, and dotted all the way around that green or that car park are lots of shops and restaurants and cafes, so anything from the high-end restaurants that serve things like lobster through to there's a pub, you've got the cafes that do things like the Cornish pasties, plenty of places also selling ice creams, and a few of the tourist tat shops, or I suppose the sorts of places that you would buy souvenirs to take back for family and friends. Given the constraints with the weather and just feeling like we needed to try and get more things done before the bad weather forecast set in this afternoon, I feel like we have been able to get a lot out of our time down on the Lizard Peninsula, and it's definitely a walk that I would highly recommend to just about anyone. I would say most abilities would be able to do it because it wasn't overly strenuous.